Anyway, so going back to the third presentation we had this morning from Floor was the paper that I was asked to comment on. Thank you for analysing these narratives of change and highlighting these different narratives that are present, but we're not always aware of the differences and the different viewpoints they put forward. So I think it's a very interesting point to start from, and place to start from, looking at how different networks put forward and conceive of these narratives. So I was thinking that these narratives are a kind of storytelling or meaning making that Richard was talking about yesterday. So they're telling us how these networks are making sense of the world in which they live and their relationship to it. But also they're functioning as more than that, because they're actually functioning as trying to instruct us in ways that they would like to see the world and the ways in which they would like to see it changed. So in a sense, they're not neutral. They are value-laden, and they're actually putting forward a point of view, and they're trying to convince us of something that we should take up. And I think that came across more clearly in the way you spoke today, more than in the paper, I think. So yes, they're defining a problem and defining a solution to it, and trying to convince other people of the truthfulness and the validity of this point of view. What I find puzzling is how these narratives not only fit alongside each other, but how they fit with existing narratives. And what particularly struck me was, what points do they challenge dominant discourses and the other dominant narratives that are existing in the world? Around capitalism and continued economic growth and those other sort of narratives. And that brings me to the idea of the actors that are putting forward the different narratives and the power of the different groups and the comparative influence that those narratives have. How do they affect change? When Tony was speaking, I was thinking about, do narratives then have agency? At what point do they become free-floating? I think there's some really interesting things to think about between the level of the networks and then actually how those get translated into ideas. So how do they become grounded in action and in the actions of people and groups at the local level, and become turned into social practices. And then again, how do people return to ideas to justify the behaviour that they're engaging in? Because we do like to justify our behaviour and have it congruent with our ideas and values. I think that would be my main comment, was how, because I think the narratives that you put forward are products of late capitalism. They sit quite happily, the idea of entrepreneurs within capitalism. So if they are going to be narratives of change, at what point do they challenge the other dominant narratives? And can they act as forms of power and authority that can, because if they are going to be forms of change, then they will need to engage with authority at some point, I think. So, but thank you for the paper. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a really interesting speech, and it's very, for me, in my opinion, it's a very good empirical base to study change. And it was also very interesting, the distinction you did in general in the project between social innovation and social change in general. And I think that is a core issue that can be further investigated. And also it was interesting, the link with the discussion we had yesterday about meaning and about synchronization. And I will say something more about this. One core issue is, and that's very interesting, is the link between narrative and power exercise and change in power. And I think that something that can give an added value to this work is put in this binom another issue, which is technology. So trying to link narratives, power, and technology. And there is also a lot of literature that can help about social construction of technology, Beaker and Pitch, and also that's interesting theory about technological drama of Pfaffenberg. It can be really interesting and fulfill with your research. So to see change, narratives can produce change, and what is the role of technology, and what is the role of narrative for technology, and what is the role of technology for narratives, for legitimate narratives. And another thing that it's really close to our research that we will present later on, it's the linkage existing between different forms of synchronization. So narratives is a very powerful form of synchronization, but there are other that can be studied together. And one thing is that in the narratives that you have studied there was both a synchronization of people around some issue, but also a synchronization of different issue in just one social context. For example, linking the example you did about transition network, so economy, environmental resources are different issues that can be combined into a single frame. And also, for example, other forms of synchronization that we have studied that can be combined and studied through the analysis of narratives are, for example, the emergence of new leadership and the emergence of myths and symbols that are specific forms of narratives, and, for example, the use of art in sustainable projects, and also something that is more common, but also that is producing synchronization among people, like participatory approaches and communication on different level. And my last suggestion is that it can be really interesting to study at the same time narratives and also counter narratives. So to see how the people that are promoting social change are viewed from the people outside, because we recorded some phenomena of dissonance with the surrounding reality. So often there is a narrative of people that want to change, but there is a counter narrative of people that are around that do not want to change. Just an example, the people are seen like hippies and people strange, or, for example, for critical mass, I can imagine all the discussion about bike that is not useful or something like that. Thank you.
Excellent. Right. Good morning.
I come from the University of Surrey.
Yes.
We have been collaborating in the framework of previous projects within the second framework program with the European Commission as well.
Yes.
The coordinator of the CRISP project.
CRISP, yes. And I hope that introduction doesn't come out of my time allocation, which is quite tight. Yes, I've been working with CRISP. It's a visioning and scenario building and backcasting project from the European Union. And what was special about this was we were looking at young people, because we had this firm belief that old people with gray hair and stuff should really not be involved in young people developing their own futures, so that semi-retirees are prescribing what the future for other people, for young people would hold. I mean, there's an agency issue there that we were addressing. And as part of that, there was also a very inspiring young lady. I call her Gwendolyn, just for safety reasons. We ran those workshops of desirable future visions, and we backcast those ones, and we developed particular narratives towards that. And afterwards, she came to me and said, "Why do you do this? Why should we worry about the future? Why should we have a choice?" And it stumped me, because she represented at that point a generation of young people who've been shoved into primary school, being told by parents and teachers to better perform so that they can get into better schools. And once they get into better schools, to be shoved into better schools so that they perform really well, so they can get to a better university. And then once they're at the better university, they're being told to really be good at that, because it all depends on jobs. And as parents, you begin to start thinking about jobs and then future of work from a very, very early time onwards. What we seem to forget is that life has a meaning. And that meaning is to be supported economically and socially and emotionally and intellectually by work. But first priority has to be the meaning. And the whole argument about backcasting and then future visions and scenarios and future of work was full of, well, you better fit to that future, because you're just an atomistic little piece in a ginormous technological wave. And that's precisely where I'm coming when I'm going to have a little comment on your paper, which I was told to review. I thought it was an absolutely fantastic piece. It was a breathtaking speed, fantastic rigor, and then quite inspiring. You're basically arguing that there are three main technological trends. You've introduced them at the beginning as well, namely globalization, digitization, and the creation innovation nexus on that. And putting those three together, you're describing in the paper and in the discussion on the future of work you have, a future world where technology begets technology. Technology drives technology, technology that is driven by technology fosters further technology, and individuals are working within that system that really is a ginormous process of fragmentation. In American slang, you would call it slicing and dicing of cultural values, social values, the disappearance of the content of place, the disappearance of social identity, the disappearance of the meaning that work can convey in Buddhist economics and so on and so on. The dissipation, the fragmentation of organizational boundaries, and the whole dissipation and the whole fragmentation of the context of social, cultural, and religious identity. And that fragmentation then leads to empowerment, because the strong structures that provide guidance towards individuals aren't there, and therefore individuals are much more empowered to develop their own activities and to develop their own phrases. And that means that actually the loss of predictability and the loss of a social framework also means a loss of identity, a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose within that. And the future is presented as a self-organized, also almost autobiotic, complex system that feeds on itself, that maintains its structure by changing its continuous organization, and that supports its own logic of change. And that's one of the nice parts of the argument, because for the paper, the question, how do we change society, doesn't pose itself, because society changes itself. And you're just one part of that overall change that comes around. I'm not sure whether this world driven by technological dominance is necessarily desirable. In the CRISP project I was talking earlier, we came up with 46 different scenarios and visions for written and proposed by young people. About 6 or 7 of them were very similar to the world you've presented. It became one of our archetypes. It was very similar. And we then asked the students also what they felt about those different visions. And unisono across all the different countries, across all the different projects, workshops we had, that was the one vision that everybody thought was most likely. but there was also the one vision nobody really liked, because it was the one vision where actually there was no meaning. You were there to make a job, you do a job, because that's what you're doing. And it sort of elevated the idea of a fragmented society and the goodness that lies in 0-hour contracts. And therefore, everybody is a self-entrepreneur. And if you don't swim, you better sink slowly, because there is no way back from that. It was quite a cold world, so to speak. And therefore, the idea about sustainability and what kind of sustainability criteria and what the resource base of a sustainable society in 2050 that may be technology driven may look like wasn't quite questioned, wasn't quite answered. We're not, this paper is not looking at sustainability. It looks at the dynamics of technological driven change, and that brings me back to Gwendolyn. Because her question, why do we do this, I think in this paper is being asked in a very unique way. Here the paper is suggesting we work because you want to, and because it's part of your self-fulfilling things. And therefore, identity is not provided but sought. And therefore, the provision for sustainable transitions and the argument that we want to pursue more sustainable livelihoods really begs the question, how can we pursue sustainability as an ethical construct, as a livelihood worth living, as a meaningful engagement with our environment, be the social, environmental, or economic, with our overall engagement. Because in many situations, it is the meaning and the thinking in the wider context that is often missing. You very eloquently discuss in the paper the trend that anything is possible, anytime, anywhere, anyhow. And what then typically happens is if you're possible to answer emails anytime, you're beginning to answer emails every time. And you begin to follow the sort of 24/7 part. And some organizations are catching up to that. Mercedes, for instance, says if you're out of office, and we put up the out of office thing, it deletes the email that comes in, on grounds that either somebody else can answer the question, or if it's really that important, you might as well ask when the guy is back in again. Likewise, Volkswagen, Seat is a subsidiary of that. They're switching the email server off. Because between 8 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning, because they don't want their managers to constantly be technologically engaged. They want them to think back, consider things, and to reflect. And I think that's an interesting part, because that very reflection then gives meaning and purpose and hopefully sustainability solutions. And if we are worried about youth unemployment, I think the biggest problem we might have is that we are not conveying the ability, or we are not conveying the chance for young people to develop meaningful lifestyles, to develop meaningful and sensible and thoughtful approaches. And if you don't think that this is important, just think about how successful ISIS is in attracting 18 to 24-year-olds with a sense of purpose, with a sense of structure, and with a sense of meaning. And I think that's probably one of the more fundamental challenges that we have in sustainability transitions. I don't even know whether I'm over 5 minutes or not. But I might as well thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have to say I liked reading the paper you sent around, especially like the element of looking on the more macro level developments like the digitalization and virtualization and all, and how they melt down in changing practices in the workplace. However, I have two questions that are rather nasty, because I see a big contradiction with what you presented as EU-Innovate mission to look on the role of user, like the workers, in producing innovation, and the presentation just like, 5-10 minutes afterwards, and the paper that they are very much, in my reading, on how to train or make the executives to think about the workplace, but not at all about the people who work there. So the future employee has no place at all in any of the discussion of the paper. That I find quite contradictory. For me, it's paradoxical to say that the user has a role to play in innovation, but then when you give recommendations of the type of work, it's all about things executives have to think about the future workplace. But in my reading, this somehow has an assumption that the user / worker / employee of the future is just a passive person that needs to go along with what the executives and all these big trends are making for him or her. And I would like your reflection on this, because I didn't find it in the paper and I didn't find it in the presentation. And the second thing is, we look a lot on this creation of agency, and I like a lot your take on looking on values, determining the actions behind change agents. However, and I'm coming from policy studies, if I look the advocacy coalition framework of Sabatier, that also talks about core beliefs and values, is being vastly criticized as having the assumption of this rigidity that is very difficult to change agents, it's very difficult to create this behavioral change, because at the end, your core is not changing. So this also comes with a question. We look a lot about changing behaviors, changing lifestyles, but if it only comes from the surface and also not touching the core, how transformative such a change is. And I want you to reflect or give some thoughts of this question from your values model. Thank you.
Thank you, Niki. Do I have time. Just 2 seconds and I'll answer, you know. First of all, can I? Can I? Okay. Excellent question, okay, first of all. And you know, don't expect complete coherence or congruency between different things I'm doing. You know, I'm a curious person, I'm doing different things. But I do want to make reflection, because I like your conclusion about ISIS, okay, what's happening over there. Number one, in the same paper, what I said is that you can become an employee and a user at the same time. Because the future, I talk about portfolio employment, which means if you are 50% employee of an organization, you have to be what White used to call many years ago a corporate man, because there is a limit in which new ideas and different ideas, disruptive ideas, are tolerated in the organization. I go back and I look at my own curriculum. I wanted to become full professor, Yale professor universities here at 40 years old. And honestly, today in retrospect, I tell you, I published a lot of garbage, in a sense that I am not proud in what I did. It was instrumental. Today, I don't do anything like this. And I can afford not to do it, not because I have tenure and I don't need it, but because I voluntarily decided to become what I talk about my paper. I am a part-time employee. I voluntarily left 25% of my commitment to the organization so I can do 25% to be a pirate. And as a pirate, I'm a user. As a pirate, you know, because I'm not threatened by it, I have 25% at least to tell them that's not the way it should be done. And if you don't want to do it here, I will do it in Rotterdam, or I'll do it in Surrey with Alan Brown. Right now I have some contact with him, or some other places that want to do it. And you'll come back to do whatever. In other words, what I'm trying to say, you have to be resourceful in finding out the solution. Now, so it's not completely contradictory, but in the paper, obviously, you know, I cannot give all these examples, and I would not say, of course, that 35% of all my publication is garbage. I'm not saying it. But what I'm saying is, we all know we have data bank, and you're trying to harmonize the data bank to the fullest. And sometimes you take the same data bank and you publish 4 or 5 papers. Is it true or not, or am I just imagining? Okay? Because it's instrumental. So what you do, you force the model, you twist the model, you look from some angle of added value. So what I'm saying is you can become a user and employee at the same time, because in the future you will not be fully committed to a single organization. That's what we predict. We call it portfolio employment. So you will work 50% for one organization where, depending on the culture, you can be or not be a user and you can change. All depends what happens in the organization, the leadership style, the tolerance to failure. A lot of organizations today don't tolerate failure. Big mistake. There is no innovation if you don't tolerate failure. Okay? Did I give you an answer? That's mainly what I want to say. But thank you very much. It's really food for thought.
So first, let me say there was no paper to read, so I will make some comments on ABM and using it here, but maybe also a bit more broadly. But I will start by addressing your closing question, so about agency and agent-based modeling. And first I must admit I was thinking, why is that question actually important? But then I thought, well, the reasoning behind is that if we cannot represent agency, do we miss something important in our models? So, and you also started with looking at complexity of models and how complex should a model be. So these two are clearly related to each other. And models, well, the clear starting point is models are always simplifications. And there might be some, well, at the advanced edge of artificial intelligence or something, there might be some things that come close to human agency, I don't know. And I think it's also not what is actually relevant for modeling in our context here for sustainability transitions. I think the agents we can reasonably represent in such broader models with many agents, many interdependencies, need to be clearly much less complex than humans are. And how complex actually an agent should be, it's a question you cannot answer in general, but of course it depends on the model purpose and the research question you want to answer with your model. I think that's something very general, but it's absolutely important always to keep in mind when discussing such questions. So you cannot answer it in general, but you have to do it case by case for each model. And the research questions typically can be, or the model purposes, and I think it's also very important to differentiate there, can be, for example, to understand certain transition patterns, looking backwards or looking at stylized facts, and to see how to explain those patterns based on the complex interactions that are going on, which you are not able to understand only by looking at them or only based on your own human mind, because computers are just in some things better than humans. That is, well, doing the pure math. So you can just calculate things straightforward and see what happens if you put a lot of assumptions and some knowledge into that model. So I think that's a use for such models. And the other one is that you explore in the future based on your assumptions. I mean, you already said that you have to be aware that you put some assumptions in there and that those might not be correct. But you can explore what happens in the future considering those assumptions are valid. So I think my general recommendation at this point always is don't make the models too complex, because it's more important to understand what's happening and to reflect on the mechanisms that are in the model and then to discuss them, for example, with stakeholders. Okay, so much for that. The second point I want to talk about, actually I was picking up one thing that you skipped in your presentation. That was on the, but I think it's particularly relevant in the context of this workshop about theories of change of sustainability transition. That was the slide about going from one equilibrium to the other one, which I think is generally not a very good representation, and I think you also meant that with your slides. It's not a good representation of what is going on in the transition for various reasons. First, I think it's not like there's one equilibrium out there in the future, but if anything, there are at least multiple ones, multiple different futures that are being shaped in the process of the transition itself. And so I would also not talk about equilibriums, but stable attractors, having said that. But I think that's a very good metaphor or thinking mode also to think about social innovation in a sense of asking the questions, and I don't have answers to that. Are there any attractors actually out there, so to say, in the beginning of a transition? And if so, what constraints those potential future attractors? So are there any fundamental things that kind of shape where the journey can go to and or not? And to what extent can it be shaped and by whom? That's also a question of power. I mean, we are talking a lot about agency, but also about power. I mean, there are key actors that can take very influential decisions, and then the journey may just have a certain space to develop further, but another part of the space might be cut off. So I think that's an interesting mode of thinking about also social innovation, and it's maybe more difficult because the constraints are less clear, at least to me, than, for example, when I talk about or think about technological innovation and technological development. But I think it can be useful, so I wanted to raise that point. And as a last related point, it's about bringing two things together, agent-based modeling of lifestyle changes. In the mode of what much of the discussion has been here, as far as I perceived it, is about people and their relations. It's kind of, and networks, it's kind of a flat ontology, if you want to say so. Assuming that, I think agent-based models should be very well equipped to model at least some important mechanisms or things that happen. And that's because you have a lot of agents and you have relations, and some interesting behavior can emerge out of those interactions, and you can use agent-based models to study that. So in principle, I think it's a valid approach to use for studying lifestyle changes. Also, there are many challenges associated, which I cannot go now into detail. But I must also raise the point, or I want to raise the point, that I'm maybe missing a bit other factors that are also discussed here and there, like how how those changes in lifestyles might be shaped. Like we have also heard technologies coming up, and also the decision of key stakeholders making decisions about infrastructure, regulations, and so on. So people might just, or not just, but often also adapt to things that are just happening based on a more macro level or exogenous factors. So I'm missing that a little bit in the discussions here, partly. And I'm finished with that.
Thank you very much.
Also, thank you. Well, Tony, it was really a pleasure to read this. It really opened my eyes for also a field that I was not aware. And thank you, George, for saying probably a lot of what I also wanted to mention. I will just focus on two issues. I also saw, yesterday I did some homework, and I saw that even artificial intelligence is being used for this individual base. So I was like really not aware of this. So I think the capacity to go forward is really high. And I also find it really useful also to talk to decision makers if you have a model that could show future development. So I really found this really useful. I'm going to focus on two things that probably are integrated in the model somehow, but it was not perceived by me. And one of them was how global issues like climate change, financial crisis, technological developments, whatever, are framing the environmental context for this. And the second one is also the micro-environments, like we saw today, transition towns, eco-village, impact hubs, or whatever. People, by being there, also change worldviews, values, practices that then they can use somewhere else, at home, at work. So this could also be, and of course, these demands that they either go there spatially and be there for a weekend on a course, but also in time, how can that work? The second thing was also, your last question made me think the opposite way, like, or beyond. And also to explain this context, I'm coming from climate change research, and we have always been talking about scenarios. Okay, so this could happen, this could happen, this could happen, and now we are trying to go the other way around. I mean, we want pathways. We have a vision, and how to reach that vision. Of course, knowing that there are multiple subvisions and features. So how could the model do the opposite? I mean, probably try to frame a vision with multiple visions or one or whatever, and then do a backcast about what agencies need to happen at different levels for this to happen. So it's really to turn the upside down. Like, we really need to have visions, but where at the different levels they could happen. And of course, if it's 250 and we want to have this vision, if we start today, then it could probably be smoother. But also ask the model, what if we don't do anything till 240? In 250, we won't have that vision. Probably it's more disruptive agencies or changes and transformations that need to happen at higher levels, or a global change of values because of one event. I don't know. So it made me think this way. So this is just my contribution. Thank you very much. Nice coffee.